In the late 1950s, a filmmaker came to Birmingham with a rather unusual idea. He wanted to make documentaries that showed real people living real lives. Now his work is beginning to be seen as an important piece of social history. But at the time, well, not everyone approved.
This building, Broadcasting House, is dedicated to sound, but we've moved in.
He sounded and looked like your typical BBC man, but Philip Donnellan was different.
I hardly know how to start.
From the late 50s to the early 80s, he made documentaries about people seldom seen on television at the time. His films were groundbreaking and sometimes very controversial.
Integration. If we are boiling mud for integration, isn't it necessary that you become a black brummie?
He's got an arm like a leg, a lady's leg, and a punch that'll sink a battleship. Big ship. It needs all the army and the navy to put the wind up. Who? Sylvester.
So who was Philip Donnellan? What did he do? And should more be done to remember him?
Philip Donnellan was a special filmmaker and an original filmmaker. He produced a body of documentaries that sought to explore the kinds of lives and activities that in the 50s and 60s particularly weren't often seen on television.
Some years ago, my father gave me good advice. He told me 4 things, and I always remember.
He seeks to allow people to speak for themselves and for those worlds to unravel for us as if for the first time.
That's never let your wife get boss of you. Never let your neighbour get too near your backbone. That is, have plenty to eat and drink. And he also told me never to back any horses, which I never do. And the last thing he told me was never to fight after I was 50.
But Donnellan was an unlikely TV pioneer. He was born in Surrey, went to public school and was an officer in the army. He'd later say working for the BBC in the Midlands had opened his eyes to a whole new world.
I suddenly found a world that was far more real than the world that I had been used to. And I wondered why I didn't see it on the screen. You had to get over the enormous obstacle, of course, of the preconceptions about the BBC. The fact that the BBC was always looked on as a sort of terribly upper crust thing, and one had the wrong accent and the wrong style and everything else. But the fact is, if you went to people honestly, people were waiting to open up their lives to you.
In the early 60s, Donnellan made a film about Birmingham's black community called The Colony.
You go to the pub with them and you're on the same site or anything of the sort. They share a drink with you. They'll take a joke as far as it goes. But when the job is finished, they just finish.
He may have come from a different background, but Donnellan often clicked with the people he was filming. Earl Crook's dad was in The Colony and the two became close friends.
Despite the fact that we do the same work, we collect the same wages and so on, we have a lot of things to exchange in common, yet we seem to be unable to get over the hump.
I would say even for today it was very unusual, because in those days my father was ostensibly working class, you know, blue collar, and Philip was definitely very establishment and, you know, very well spoken. And I know that off camera Philip and my father used to speak quite a lot. Again, as I say, as West Indian youngster, you weren't privy to adult conversation. But I am aware that Philip had quite radical views for such an establishment figure, and he was obviously interested in getting a standpoint from ostensibly the working class, or the blue collar class as it was.
England was the saddest and the loneliest country ever an Irishman could ever put his foot in it. Very sorry to have to say about it now, because some of the English people have come around to understand the Irish way and everything like that.
Donnellan made documentaries about working people across Britain, like The Irishman, a film about immigrant workers in the 60s. The communities he filmed now see his work as an important historical record.
History isn't the dukes and the generals and the admirals. It's the ordinary people who are part of history. They were the building blocks. And people are getting more and more interested in that.
you know, the Irish had a huge impact on Britain, and they kind of not only built Britain in some ways too, but they, you know, made the history too.
Do you think it still has a relevance today at all?
I think, well, history is all important, I think, to show the young people what it was like when we did come over, like, you know.
At the time, BBC bosses weren't quite so impressed. They thought The Irishman was shapeless, pretentious and boring, and it was pulled. But there may have been other reasons.
Philip had a very abrasive relationship with almost all management, almost on principle, I think. He needed that kind of grit, if you like. And I think they needed him and he needed them.
They've proved themselves the best people in the world. They went to the States, they've made good. They went to France, they've made good. But they won't make good in England.
It's quite possible that Philip did just upset the wrong person. He could do that. He could be quite naughty sometimes about almost picking a fight with someone, particularly if he didn't think much of them, if he didn't respect them.
My Johnny's gone.
Donnellan didn't fall out with all the bosses. There were supporters too, and he needed their help when he turned his attention to more controversial subjects.
They're not fighting for an ideal, just a soldier, just trying to do his duty to Queen and country, to Queen and empire. But what were they really fighting for? You ask them this question and they can give you no answer.
Gone for a Soldier in 1980 was a critical look at the British Army.
One or two people had seen it and said, oh no, we can't show this. And David Attenborough, who was Philip's boss at the moment, said, yes, we must definitely show it, because David realised that Philip was a good, all right, controversial, but an interesting film director. But it was touch and go.
What is a soldier? A man forced down under the brutalising machine of military life.
Gone for a Soldier was one of Donnellan's last documentaries. He retired in 1984 after 36 years at the BBC. It was a career he looked back on with mixed emotions.
He'd be very cheesed off with the things that didn't go right, but he did actually manage to make films about the subjects he wanted to make films about, kind of hell or high water, because, as I say, he had the courage of his convictions. He wanted these people to be known and recognised and appreciated.
Donnellan died in 1999, and almost 30 years after his final film was broadcast, there are now plans to open up a central archive of his work. So this maverick Midlands filmmaker could soon get the recognition some say he deserves.
Ultimately, Donnellan is a classy and interesting filmmaker and deserves to sit alongside other famous filmmakers, whether they're in fiction or documentary. We don't have a good record of the millions of Irish men and women who had to migrate to work, nor do we have consistent and extensive records of Black and Asian people. And, you know, Donnellan's one of those people who went out to find out about those stories and allowed people to talk about it.